Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate you sharing your Thursday evening. Weather worked out for us for this evening. I apologize for the afternoon golfers, but we made it. So thank you for sharing your time. Our goal tonight is for you to have some fun, have a few drinks, enjoy some food, learn a little bit about estate planning and succession planning. Hopefully enjoy the speakers that we have for this evening.
So just to give you a clue about how I think of estate planning, this sentence came, I spent a number of years in a role as an insurance advisor after starting off as a tax and estate planning specialist for insurance companies. And my partner was, for lack of a better term, an old school insurance sales guy, but who sold lots of really big cases. And he would always say to his clients, you want to boil estate planning down to its most basic idea. It's all about getting your stuff where you want it to go with as little hassle and as little tax as possible. And as long as you stick to that as your basic tenet in terms of what's driving your estate planning, you're going to be in good shape. I find, quite honestly, a lot of people try and overthink estate planning. It sometimes takes very simple things to save estates tons of money and tons of time. I can tell you at least once a week I get a question, especially because I deal with insurance advisors from across the country. They say, I have a client who says they need a trust. And I say, why do they say they need a trust? Tell me in English what you want to achieve. The role of the professionals in your life that you work with, our role is to figure out what the vehicles you need are to get you to the place you want to go. Put it in English terms. You know, coming from the insurance world, and we'll talk about this, I think, just a little bit in a couple of the slides, one of the most powerful estate planning tools is a beneficiary designation. It's a very simple thing. It actually costs you nothing to buy sometimes an insurance-based product instead of something else that's not insurance-based. But it gives you estate bypass. We're in BC. How much is the estate administration tax, probate fees here? Does anybody know? 1.4% of your gross estate value, net only of mortgages on real estate. That's a pretty big number. That's a simple thing you can do. There are other simple techniques to avoid probate, but that's just one of them. And since I work for an insurance company, I might as well pitch it a little bit. So let's talk about the case study we're going to talk about. And one thing Eric said, we're going to do this case study based as opposed to just throwing a bunch of law and boring crap out at you. One thing I've learned a lot in the last few years in this business is I looked at even stuff I did earlier in my career and what other insurance companies present. And too often you see, and maybe this is you, but two perfectly healthy 60-year-olds walking on the beach, with the grandkids trailing behind, more money than they know what to do with. And it's not the reality. I'm not going to ask because we've got a lot of people in the room, but I would hazard to guess there are people who have been separated or divorced. There are people who might be in second marriages sitting at this table, have kids from multiple marriages. These are the realities that we deal with in this world every day. Look, I'm separated myself, so I'm dealing with some of this stuff in my own planning and changing things around. So let's talk about the Faulkners, who were married in 2001. We've got Tom, he's 48. He has a son from the previous marriage, Nolan, who has a severe learning disability since birth. He's 20 years old now. Again, I didn't want to make it vanilla. Let's deal with some real problems that people have. He married Roberta, who's 9 years younger. She has a son, Aaron, 13 years old, daughter, Catherine, both from her one marriage before. Could have been two marriages, but and it's not that I haven't seen that before either, right? My father-in-law just, I shouldn't smile about this, passed away about a month ago. And he was, my mother-in-law passed 18 years ago. He buried his third wife less than a year before he died. So like people do go through this. This is kind of normal. And then a year ago, they adopted a son themselves. So they've got a baby at home. So you think about this sort of blended family situation. We see, I don't know if any of you, as I said, are in this kind of situation, but this is not uncommon. And it'll give us a little bit more depth to dive into and learn from. So let's look at the sort of money side of things for Tom and Roberta. So Tom's got a $750,000 apartment in Richmond that's paid off. Hasn't put any money aside in a TFSA, has a little bit of RSP money, owns a couple cars, and he's a business person. He owns a successful software company, and he could be making widgets. It doesn't matter what kind of business, but his interest in the business is worth almost $1.5 million. So how many people in the room, just quick show of hands, are business owners? And you're aware of the lifetime capital gains exemption. Said about $1 million, indexed to inflation, budget said it's going to increase to 1.25, but then it's going to hold there for a couple years before it indexes to inflation again. He's above that number. So if he passed away today, there would be some capital gains because he would be deemed to dispose of his shares unless he gave them to Roberta. But odds are Tom has a shareholders agreement with his partners who are going to buy Roberta out anyways and trigger the capital gains at that point. Now, Roberta on her side, she's got some cash. She had insurance on her late husband's life. I didn't tell you that part, but her first husband passed away. She's a widow. And so she's got $870,000 of cash sitting in the bank. She, unlike Tom, has lots in her RSP. She's got almost 400 grand sitting in her RSP. She's been maxing out her TFSAs pretty much and has $78,000 sitting there. And even if she hadn't before her husband passed away, she might have had more insurance and just maxed out her TFSA so she wouldn't have to pay tax on the income at that point. She's got some debt from being a PhD student at UBC, and she hasn't been so smart with her credit card debt. She's got about 45 grand in credit card debt. We all following? Okay. But we'll do more tragic things. We won't have to follow these numbers too closely. Don't worry. So where are they now 3 years later? Let's fast forward. Now the kids are a little older. All of a sudden, Roberta's cash is actually a little lower. She's got $755,000 in cash, but she paid off her debt. She got rid of the good move, paid off her student loans, paid off the credit cards, got rid of that expense. Those are non-deductible interest expenses. No reason to keep them, especially if you have cash. Her RSP's grown a little bit. She's got $415,000 now in the RSP, just due to the sort of normal returns of a conservative portfolio. She had a large surge in her TFSA due to some good market performance, and she's only working part-time because remember, she's still got a 4-year-old at home. This is only 3 years later, and the Remy was 1. Enough to pay her share of the operating costs for the family, but not anything crazy. So she's working half weeks. Now, Tom he was advised by his wife to start putting money in his TFSA. So now he's got a little bit in there. The apartment in Richmond, which was paid off, is now worth $909,000 instead of $750,000. Although presumably, Eric, were they living in the apartment? But they weren't together. Yeah. So they're together. It's a principal residence. There's no capital gains there, but it's not like they can sell it and liquidate it and use it. His RSP took a hit because he got aggressive in there. He went the opposite way of his wife's TFSA. This kind of stuff happens. 2 cars, whatever. Cars are things that go down in value over time. They're not worth much. His software company continues to grow, and it's actually doubled in size over 3 years, which particularly in that world, in 3 years, it's either multiplied significantly or it's out of business. That's the nature of the tech world. He's paying himself enough to cover off his alimony to his ex, whatever child support goes with that, household bills, moderate savings. But one of the reasons the business has grown is most of his profits he's pouring back into the business, which is pretty typical. I'm sure the business owners in the room can agree that those are sometimes tough decisions. Do I take it for me or do I put it back in the business to make it grow? But when you start to see a business that is growing, it makes it sometimes a very easy decision to leave money in there and make that company continue to grow. It's one of the reasons, and I'm not asking for an answer on this, and I had a lot of business owner clients when I was an advisor. A lot of them don't invest into the traditional passive investments and prefer to, except for very conservatively in things like GICs, because they say if I invest in myself, in the business, I'm going to get big returns. And I just keep pouring my money back in. So this is the picture 3 years later. Things have grown up, evolved, kids are a little older. Tragedy strikes. 2025. Roberta and Tom, and by the way, we're going to make them live too. It's not going to be all wah, okay? Roberta and Tom passed suddenly at the start of 2025. Tragic accident. They're driving to an end-of-year work event. It's the time of year when often that stuff happens. They were the only fatalities, and the investigation concluded that it was faulty brakes on Tom's old and poorly maintained vehicle. Sorry, I'm laughing. I don't know why I'm laughing. But because it's pretend, right? They had never found the time to seek out a proper financial plan, and they didn't even have wills. Now, I want you to think about this a second. Remember that they've each have kids and a kid together. This is going to get messy. So think about what's going to happen, and think about the first thing I said to you on the very first slide. Estate planning is making sure your stuff goes where you want it to go with as little hassle and as little tax as possible. Now you die without a will. Well, the Wills, Estates, and Succession Act lays out a strict set of rules if you die what we call in the legal world intestate. Intestate means dying without a will. The court has to appoint an administrator. Someone has to apply, and the court has to appoint them. Someone's going to have to come forward because, and it may very well be one of Tom's kids because they're adults, but someone's going to have to come forward to want to be that administrator. The court's going to have to approve. This is unlike a traditional executor of a will. The court's going to have to approve every single act that they do. Everything. They can't really make a move other than maybe like pay a bill, a basic bill, without getting court approval, which is expensive. Their job is to sell everything ASAP and distribute cash. And then you've got minors in the mix too. Public guardian and trustee is going to step in for the minors because you haven't chosen trustees. And then what there is going to go to the next of kin in a set of exhaustive clauses. And you've made no statement about guardianship either. Now, for anyone, does anyone have little kids still? Or minor kids? Okay. So, do you have a will?
Almost done.
Okay. So one of the things, though, I'm sure your lawyer talked to you about is putting a guardianship clause in there. Now, you can't appoint a guardian. Only the courts can appoint a guardian, and the courts will always do what's in a kid's best interest. But the courts also don't know the people involved really intimately. And generally, courts will put a lot of trust in what the parents give as guidance. I'll say from my own experience when my kids were younger, because my kids are now, I have 21-year-old twins and a 16-year-old. So it's kind of not really the same kind of concern around guardianship and dealing with all of this stuff. I mean, my ex and I spent a ton of time drafting our will and deciding, particularly on the financial side, because it's not like we were rich, and Ontario isn't different than BC. You got an expensive house with a big mortgage. right? Like, and you got good cash flow, but I'm also in the insurance business. And I was the main earner in the house, and I had $5 million of term insurance on me when I was young. And that was meant to take care of either my wife and kids if something happened to me, or if something happened to both of us, it's for the kids. And so we spent a lot of time figuring out, not only who was going to look after the money, because that's really important. You're going to put $5 million in someone's hands to look after your kids. You better friggin' trust them. Now, the guy who we picked, look, this is a guy who's now the senior VP of marketing for PepsiCo International, wouldn't be looking to steal the money for himself. He's a good dad himself, married, has his own kids, and it's a very separate decision though from guardianship. And we had designed a whole bunch of different clauses. You don't have to pick the same person since you're working on it. And it's actually a good idea to have two different people, or even multiple trustees, and who you want to be the guardian. Keep, sort of church and state separate, so to speak. We had also designed clauses about how we wanted the kids taken care of. We weren't going to rely on what's in the Trustees Act to restrict the trustee. We said, if the kids want money for certain different things, there were things that we sort of said, that's okay. They can encroach on the capital if they have to pay for certain types of things. And we wanted to give, because we trusted the person, a high level of discretion on both the investment side and the distribution side. So if you die with a spouse, it's 2 years for common law in Alberta, and no kids, everything goes to the spouse. If you die with a spouse and kids, then the first $300,000, which is called the preferential share, goes to the spouse, and plus the household furnishings, and the rest is divided 50-50 between the spouse and kids, no matter how old they are. If you have descendants and no spouse, then it just goes down the line. Now, if you have no spouse, no kids, then it goes to your parents. No spouse, no kids, no parents. Siblings are next, then nieces and nephews. It doesn't often get past siblings or nieces and nephews, but it still could. It still could. And eventually, if there's absolutely no next of kin, well, you go to the SG Act first, which you do what's called a table of consanguinity. So if you had like no grandparents, no parents, no siblings, no nieces, no nephews, no kids, no spouse, nobody, what they do is they draw a family tree. And whoever's alive in your family and is the fewest steps away from you, they get the money. And if there's a tie, then it's split between or amongst them, as the case may be. It's very, very rarely happens. And if there's absolutely no next of kin, like somebody lives to 120, was never married, never had kids, and so everyone else who was related to them is gone, and they never had kids or anything, so there's like no one here, then the government gets the money. But I hear the misnomer from people, or the concern very often that if I die without a will, the government's going to take my money. They're not. It's still going to go to your family, but you're not going to get to choose where it goes. There are rules. So,
I would assume it takes a lot longer.
Yes.
Money to be dispersed.
Yes. Look, I can tell you, and I've talked to people in different provinces, so like there's no set rule, but even with a will where you need to seek probate, most provinces you're looking at 12 months minimum to get through probate. Some it's as long as 18. With nobody contesting anything, just making application, writing a check for your estate administration tax, and waiting for the courts to approve the will as being the last will. Without a will, what if people are fighting, right? Like we're not even taking into account the concept of people contesting things and making it difficult. It can take years. And basically, other than covering off basic bills, no one's going to have power to do anything to look after the kids. And we've got a bunch of kids in the mix here. That's messy. So think about this. Just a quick example, $1 million estate. Somebody dies without a will, with a spouse and a couple kids. The preferential share, the $300,000 goes to the wife. The balance is $700, 50% to the spouse, 50% to the two kids. They could be babies. The public guardian and trustee might just be sticking that money in a GIC till their age of majority and giving it to them then. I grew up in Ontario where we had a student loan program called OSAP, Ontario Student Assistance Plan. When I was in university, we nicknamed it the Ontario Stereo Acquisition Program. Because what happens when you give an 18 or 19-year-old a bunch of cash? They're going to spend it. If you gave a 19-year-old $175,000, most are not responsible enough to know what to do or how to handle it. Hopefully mom can guide them, but there's no guarantees. There's yeah. Kirk, it happens. By the way, that's, like, we say it tongue in cheek, but it happens. At the end of the day, intestacy is a crappy ending to all of this because your last wishes aren't carried out. You haven't decided where your stuff goes. You can't build tax efficiency into a non-decision as well. You actually, as you may or may not know, almost any kind of property, not just capital property, in the Income Tax Act, when you transfer property between spouses, typically it goes on what we call a rollover basis. There's no taxes when money moves between spouses, even if there's deferred taxation, like on capital property, real estate, business shares, things like that. Because you have assets that are being cashed in and transferred to the kids, you lose the tax-free spousal rollover on that. Because most people who, like, kind of in the old, traditional one marriage with kids kind of situation, most people's basic will planning is, I leave everything to my spouse. If my spouse dies before me, everything to my kids. And here are the trusts if the kids are minors. That's sort of most, when I practice law, that's how most couples' wills looked if they were first marriages. But you die without a will, you lose that opportunity potentially. So let's think about all the kids in this mix now. We've got kids from multiple marriages, right? Remember Remy. So we have two sets of answers on this slide. Top line is, what if both Tom and Roberta basically made all four kids their own? So there were adoptions or settled intentions to treat the kids. Then we're 25% across the board, right? Because they're all four of them are kids of both. But what if, we had a couple older kids? Like, there might not even be an opportunity to have a settled intention to treat them as a child. You definitely couldn't legally adopt them because they're adults. You have a situation with Nolan, who was one of Tom's kids, who was Tom's kids. He would get 50% of Tom's estate. There's no preferential share, remember, anymore, because there's no spouse who survived. They died in an accident together. And you get nothing from Roberta. Remy, who was both their kid, would get 50% of his dad's, because him and Nolan are brothers and would split their dads, and 1/3 of his mom's. Now, Aaron and Catherine, who were both Roberta's kids, would get none of Tom's and just 1/3 of their mom's estate because they'd have to split it with Remy. So the youngest one would actually have the biggest inheritance. Most couples, when they go and look at their big picture, this isn't how they'd want things to look, would be my guess. And so you don't leave things to chance. It's why planning is important. So, what if they actually did the planning? Same tragedy strikes, but they actually, in the years leading up to 2025, sat down with a good estates and trust lawyer, worked with their investment and insurance advisors, and actually did a little bit of planning. There's a lot that they could do to look after this family. First of all, they do wills, okay? Like, let's just assume that wills they're gonna sit down and make the decision about how they want their assets divided. What are some of the other things they could do? Well, Nolan, I told you, is severely disabled. Have you guys heard of a Henson Trust? Okay, so a Henson Trust Henson was a case out of Ontario, but it's good law right across the country. So people with disabilities who don't have income can claim disability support payments from the province. And one of the concerns in obtaining those payments is if your income goes too high or you have too much assets, you no longer can claim the benefits. So if you leave a disabled child a big inheritance, all of a sudden they don't qualify for the disability support payments that they used to. A Henson Trust we sometimes nickname it a poverty trust. So basically it's a trust for that kid, or could be an adult kid who's disabled, where the money's not theirs. There's a trustee or trustees who manage the money, and it can be used to pay for certain things for them that don't ruin their ability to claim ODSP. It can pay living expenses. And there's nowhere in the disability support legislation that says you can't live somewhere nice, right? You don't have to live off of what's paid as disability support payments. You can live somewhere nicer. I grew up, my family owned a restaurant growing up, like a bagel place in the north end of Toronto. And there was this one guy, 6 o'clock in the morning, he would come in, and like he had some mental illness, and so like this guy, like he's on disability support payments. It's not like we were an expensive place, but he would be in between 5:30 and 6 a.m. every morning and buy breakfast. And he would actually sit with my friend's dad. The two of them sat kitty corner at a table for four, never talked to each other, but they sat together every single morning. And one afternoon, I was working, and I look outside and I see him outside. I said, I never see this guy other than at like 6 in the morning. He gets picked up in a Rolls Royce and taken to the condo building that was right behind the restaurant. So you can live nicely, and he likely was collecting disability support payments. That paid for the bagel every morning, right? What about moving Roberta's cash into segregated funds? So segregated funds are an interesting concept or an interesting product in the world. And basically they're like mutual funds, but they have an insurance wrapper around them. Like just speaking for RBC, like in our seg fund product, they're all RBC Global Asset Management and Phillips Hager North. They're all kind of like our own proprietary funds, but it has an insurance wrapper around it, which comes with certain guarantees. But more importantly, from an estate planning point of view, comes with the ability to appoint a beneficiary. So her funding for this Henson Trust, whether it's registered money or not, and we know she had some money, could just be paid directly into that trust without any probate, quickly, immediately. And by the way, a death claim on a segregated fund policy, forget about tying it up in an estate, because it doesn't become part of the estate. We're talking about days, maybe weeks, not months or years. Like insurance companies, when we get a death claim, we just want to pay the money out. There's no controversy over people dying usually. We get a death certificate and a claim, we don't want the money anymore. Like, we'll pay it. The will outlines what will happen to their property, names the executor, make sure everything is looked after. And they picked a guardian. Roberta has a sister, Pat, who's young enough, and they've got a 1-year-old. And, you have to consider the age of your kids. I used to give clients advice when I was practicing all the time. And they'd say, well, I want my parents to be the guardians for my kids. I'm like, really? First of all, have you asked them? I said, secondly, when your kids are teenagers, your parents are going to be in their late 60s or 70s. Are you sure they're going to want the responsibility of driving your 15-year-old across the province to play in a basketball game? It's hard. What if they had life insurance on each other? There would have been a whole bunch of money. And term insurance is cheap. They were relatively young. The shares would have been taken care of if a proper shareholder agreement was done too. Just like sort of a quick down and dirty, just think about this with probate, and I'll leave this in the benefits of a beneficiary designation and why it's important. When you're in, and I'm sorry because she works for a mutual fund company, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, bank GICs, not only do you have that 1.4% estate administration tax, the lawyers are at the trough, the accountants are at the trough, potentially trustees. It can take months or years to get the money out. It's a matter of public record. Be aware of that. And there's no creditor protection built into it. There is potential creditor protection with insurance contracts, no guarantees, huge estate costs. With seg funds, basically, you take all that to zero, get the money paid out. And by the way, just from a tax point of view, because I did say I'm a tax guy, when you're deemed to dispose of your property at death, the tax bill is based on the number when you die. Even if it takes 3 years for the money to get distributed and the funds go down in that time. Doesn't matter how much is eventually distributed, the value for tax purposes is at death. This is a helpful thing. So I just want you to keep this in mind. And the power of whole life insurance. It's very different than the term insurance that you bought when you're young. Any owners of whole life or universal life insurance here? Oh, good. So people who need to be talked to. So when you bought term insurance when you were young, you bought insurance for if you die. You bought insurance to cover off your debt, replace your income, cover off your mortgage, pay for your kids' education and final expenses, right? Like the basic stuff. And if you died, you were paying a cheap price for a short amount of time. What did Ben Franklin say are the two certainties in life? Death and taxes. Okay, so what if I told you there was insurance that pays out when you die? It grows tax deferred and pays out tax-free at the end. We know the death is still certain, but we can reduce or eliminate the tax altogether. So I just want to show you just a quick contrast. If we took $20,000 a year for the next 20 years and stuck it in a GIC, just on the personal side, I'm not even building the corporate side into this here. I'm going to have to pay tax all the way along as I go. And I'm going to have about $100,000 out at age 85, right, Eric? 40 years later?
885,
Yeah.
This is $1 million. It should be $1 million.
Yeah, it's $1 million. 999, 737. Now, if I do the same thing on the insurance side, the power of the tax deferral, and it's only the tax deferral. It's extremely conservative. I don't want to get into product details, but you're talking over $2 million. But just remember, I'm not talking about buying insurance for if you die. You're buying insurance for when you die. As long as the premiums are paid, we pay out. It's a very different mindset. You have to think about it in terms of almost rates of return, because death is a certainty. The only uncertainty is timing of it. But the policy grows over time. So if you live longer, you're just leaving your kids more money. Or a charity if you don't want to leave your kids more money. Because I've heard that from clients before too. It's too much money. Want to make the kids work, blah, blah, blah. So the bottom line is you're putting another $1.4 million on the table through tax savings, not through aggressive investing, not through having to make difficult investment decisions. You will sleep every night, because whole life insurance, much like a GIC, when you earn money every year, it vests in the policy. Can never have a negative return, can never be taken back. It's a powerful product. There's a reason it's been sold in this market for over 150 years, and it's not going anywhere. It fell out of style for about 10, and everyone realized it's still the best thing from a permanent insurance point of view. Let your money grow in an insurance policy. Okay, that's it.
Thanks for that, Mitch. These are topics that aren't super fun to talk about. Like, no one wants to think about death or taxes, but it's important to have these conversations when things are good.